It's pretty wild how one single word, a word that feels just a little bit out of place in a huge book, can become this massive lightning rod for criticism. Can one word really define or maybe even undermine an entire volume of scripture? All right, let's dive into this fascinating controversy.
So to really get a handle on this, you have to look at the numbers. We are talking about one single word out of more than 267,000 in the entire Book of Mormon. That ratio right there is really at the heart of this whole debate.
And that brings us to the big question, right? Can one word, a tiny, tiny fraction of the text, actually carry enough weight to invalidate the whole thing? It's a question that really forces you to think about faith, criticism, and what translation even means.
All right, so what is this word that has caused so much fuss? Let's get into it. Okay, so the word is adieu, and it only shows up one time, right at the very end of the book of Jacob, chapter 7, verse 27. It just says, "Brethren, adieu." And yeah, for a book that's supposed to be an ancient American record, seeing a French word pop up is, well, it's definitely a head-scratcher.
Now, adieu isn't just some casual bye-bye. It has this really rich history. It comes straight from the French adieu, which literally means to God. It was a very formal, very solemn way of saying goodbye, like you were truly commending someone to God's protection.
And this, right here, is the absolute heart of the criticism. How in the world could a French word end up in a text from ancient prophets in the Americas, centuries before French as we know it even existed? For critics, this is an open and shut case. It's an anachronism, a slip-up, that proves the book is just a 19th century invention.
But there's another side to this story, and the counter-argument isn't about the original language at all. Instead, it's all about the process of translation. So, here's the crucial point. The Book of Mormon we read today is an English translation. The argument goes that the translator, Joseph Smith, was using the language he knew, the vocabulary of the 19th century, to get across the meaning and the feeling of the original text. And adieu wasn't some weird, obscure word back then. It was actually part of educated English, popping up in literature and even in the notes of the King James Bible. The idea is that it was chosen to capture the heavy, emotional finality of Jacob's last words, not as a literal word-for-word translation.
And what's really fascinating is that the book itself kind of hints at this human element. There's this verse in Ether that talks about a weakness in the writing, basically admitting that the process of getting these divine records down on paper can involve some human imperfection.
This whole back and forth leads us to this really powerful metaphor that completely reframes the debate, moving it from a simple squabble over words to a deeper question about intent and perspective.
The argument is that obsessing over adieu is a classic example of a logical trap, one that was pointed out in a very famous biblical analogy about hypocrisy. The analogy is straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. In this context, the gnat is the single French word, a tiny little detail, a stylistic choice from the translator. But the camel, well, that's everything else. The other 250,000+ words, the core testimony of Jesus Christ, the complex doctrines. So the question becomes, by focusing so hard on the gnat, are critics completely missing the camel walking right by? Okay, so let's do that. Let's zoom out and talk about the camel for a minute. Let's talk about the bigger picture that this line of criticism tends to ignore.
The whole point here is that this kind of criticism just shows you're looking through the wrong end of the telescope. It suggests a mindset that's so busy looking for tiny flaws that it becomes totally blind to the vast spiritual message that makes up the real substance of the book.
This idea gets summed up perfectly in a quote from a modern church leader, Elder Jeffrey R. Holland. It shifts the whole debate away from tiny textual details to the book's overall moral power. It basically poses a dilemma. Either the book is a massive fraud written by a good man, which doesn't make sense, or it's exactly what it claims to be.
So in the end, this whole thing isn't just about the text, is it? It circles right back to the person reading it. It all comes down to a question of intent.
You can really see two completely different ways to go about it. On one hand, you have the person who's searching for fault, someone who comes in already determined to find mistakes and inconsistencies. On the other hand, you can approach it searching for truth with an openness and a humility to try and understand the core message. The argument is, what you're looking for is probably what you're going to find.
And believe it or not, the Book of Mormon itself has something to say about this mindset, describing people who put their own intellectual fault-finding ahead of a spiritual search for real understanding.
And that leaves us with this one last thing to think about.
When we dig into a text like this, what really tells us more? The tiny flaw we managed to find? Or the fact that we were searching for a flaw in the first place? It's a question of perspective that goes way, way beyond one word in one book.